contextualize. All right. So and this is being recorded and it will be available on Alianza America's YouTube and in our various websites. So we're really thrilled that you have zoomed in for this conversation on contextualizing the migrant narrative. This is part 3 of a conversation and dialogue on addressing, one specifically is focusing on addressing the tensions between historically marginalized communities. As we know, over the past couple of years, hundreds of thousands of people have arrived in the United States at the US-Mexican border seeking protection, part of an unprecedented global migration of people displaced from their homelands. 35,000 of these individuals have come to the Chicago area. However, recently, border states of Texas, Arizona, and Florida have started transporting many of these new arrivals, many of whom are legitimately seeking and legally seeking asylum, on buses and planes to cities that are predominantly have Democratic mayors and or states that are cities that have declared themselves to be sanctuary cities, primarily Washington, D.C., New York, and Chicago. The arrival of these migrants, in addition to the more than 11 million long-term immigrants in the United States, most of whom are undocumented, has exposed the serious challenges in the social policies meant to promote the well-being of all people that comprise U.S. society today. If handled appropriately, the situation presents us with an opportunity to demonstrate how communities and governments can rise to the occasion of providing a dignified and humane treatment of vulnerable situations and populations. But it also helps to address the historical tensions between marginalized groups. Today, I am thrilled that we are going to take a deeper dive into shining a direct light on the tensions that are unfolding between Black and new immigrant arrivals, but also the emerging tensions between new arrivals and long-term immigrants. We want to understand these tensions, and we have an amazing panel that's going to help us have a dialogue on that. So we want to understand the tensions, but we also want to explore what is being done to proactively address them. We have a focus on Chicago, where most of our organizations that put this webinar series are located, and most of our panelists live. So I want to give a reminder and a thanks to all of our convening organizations, Alianza Americas, for their leadership in helping to put this together and manage all the logistics today. The Center for American Progress, which, as you know, is DC based. The Latino Policy Forum, which I lead, which is here in Chicago. The National Immigrant Justice Center, which is national, but also based here in Chicago. And the Resurrection Project, a Chicago-based community organization. So that's a little bit of a setup, and now a little bit for housekeeping. So again, thank you for joining us today. This event will be in English with Spanish interpretation. So you may enable this feature on the bottom right corner of your Zoom screen. So please, we'll reserve about the last 20 minutes or so for your questions. So please use the Q&A function that's in the Zoom link to share your questions with the panelists, because we've disabled the chat function and we've disabled hand raise for security purposes. So again, please put your questions in the chat throughout the conversation. And now in my less than perfect Spanish, for those that, gracias por acompañarnos. Este evento será en inglés con interpretación en español. Puede habilitar esta función en la esquina inferior derecha de la pantalla en Zoom. Por favor, utilice la función de preguntas y respuestas para enviar sus mensajes. Dedicamos los últimos 20 minutos de esta conversación para responder a sus preguntas y que ya que la función de chat y la posibilidad de levantar la mano virtual se han desactivado por motivos de seguridad. So, ojalá que puedas encontrar esa pantalla en Zoom. And again, we will be doing this in English, and you're free to ask your questions in English or Spanish. Puedes preguntar sus preguntas también en español. Okay, so I am saving my language. So a reminder again that this is part 3 of a 3-part series. So we may not get to all of the issues that you're concerned about, but a reminder that In the first webinar, we discussed the shortcomings of U.S. foreign policy and the need for more effective, inclusive and democratic measures in the region, and really the roots of why we have the migration situation that we're now seeing unfolding at our borders and in our cities. The second focused on how Chicago is managing the influx of individuals that are seeking safety and support. And today, as I mentioned, we're going to head into some of the tensions and the opportunities and some of the really good work that is happening as many of our new neighbors have come to Chicago. So as I mentioned, I'm Sylvia Puente, President and CEO of the Latino Policy Forum. We are a small nonprofit in Chicago that works on issues of education, housing, and immigration. And we have a leadership academy that brings together Black and Latino community leaders to promote positive change. So in this context, we convene the Welcome to Illinois Coalition that meets every other week to provide information and resources on the current migrant situation. And you can learn more about that in the chat. And we also convene a leadership academy that brings together Black and Latino community leaders who will undertake an initiative to better understand the migrant situation and develop resources and materials that can be used in community settings. So just those resources, we'll share information on them at the end. And I'll be done talking in a few minutes, guys. But let me give due to the amazing group of panelists that we have here and introduce them as well. So Bill, nice to meet you. Good to see you. Thank you for joining us. Bill is joining us, I believe, from Washington, D.C., and he's been an activist since his youth. Upon graduating from college, he went to work as a welder in a shipyard, entering the labor movement. He's been active in workplace and community struggles and electoral campaigns. He's worked for numerous unions, in addition to serving as senior staff person in the National AFL-CIO. Fletcher is the former president of Trans-Africa Forum, a senior scholar with the Institute for Policy Studies, and in the leadership of several other projects. He is co-author with Peter Agard of The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, 1934 to 1941. He's co-author with Fernando Gaspasian of Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, and the author of They're Bankrupting Us, the 20 Other Myths About Unions. Fletcher is a syndicated columnist and a regular media commentator on television, radio, and on the web. Welcome, Bill. We have Pastor Matt DiMatteo. Pastor Matt has been working with young people in Chicago since 2020. He lives and serves in the Little Village neighborhood of Chicago's Southwest Side with his wife, Sarah, and 3 children, Bella, Ben, and Robert. Matt began serving as a pastor full-time with New Life Community Church in 2006. For years, he has seen all of their community development efforts in Little Village and helped build and grow the nonprofit New Life Centers. In 2013, Matt became executive director of New Life Centers, and what started as a small group of volunteers has now grown to at least, I think, 200 staff, he said to me the other day, Matt, and hundreds of volunteers who work with loving on young people in Chicago and who are working to assist migrants as they come to Chicago. New Life Centers has served over 5,000 youth and families, has more than 750 volunteers. And as I mentioned, they've been doing amazing work in resettling new migrants, which he'll share more about with us. Also on the panel is Erendira Rendon, who has created the Resurrection Project's Immigrant Justice Department and serves as the organization's lead strategist and manager on the local and statewide campaigns impacting the lives of immigrants. She has played a leading role in the successful passage of pro-immigrant legislation in Illinois, including the temporary visitor driver's license, the expansion of healthcare to undocumented adults in Illinois, the Chicago Legal Protection Fund, the creation of the Immigration Unit of the Law Office of Cook County Public Defender, and Illinois Access to Justice. Ede is herself an undocumented immigrant with DACA protection. She was born in Oaxaca, Mexico, and immigrated to the United States in 1990 to be reunited with her father. and is a graduate of the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, an alum of the Civic Leadership Academy and the University of Chicago and Leadership Greater Chicago. She has also been leading the process of enabling new migrants to obtain work permits, work authorization here in Chicago, and is a leader in the movement to gain parole and work authorization for long-term immigrants. Benji Hart, good to see you, Benji. Their words have appeared or are forthcoming in anthologies from Oxford Press, Beacon Press, Haymarket Books, Pluto Press, and have been published at Time, Teen Vogue, and The Advocate, the Flimsy, and elsewhere. They have led popular education and arts-based workshops for organizations internationally, including Project NIA, Forward Together, Sister Song, and Dissenters, and presented at the Barnard Center for Research on Women, the American Repertory Theater, the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and the Chicago Architectural Biennial. Their performances have been featured in the Poetry Foundation, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Denfire, and Museo del Chopo. They have received fellowships from Yaddo, McDonald, Chicago Dance Makers Forum, and are Kristen Broker Family Artist in Residence at the Lab School. In this context, in addition to being an amazing artist and poet, Benji is a Woodlawn resident and lives across the street from the Wadsworth Shelter and is working with Concord Baptist Missionary Church to build relationships between long-term residents, Woodlawn residents, and their new immigrant neighbors. So, gave a lot about you guys, just so the audience could understand what an amazing panel we have. I want to thank you all for being here. So just to kick us off, tell us a little bit more about your organization, your work in this space, and why you're involved in addressing this migrant issue. And I'll have Ede lead us off.
So buenos dias, and thanks everybody for joining. Thank you, Sylvia, for moderating. A little bit of background about TRP is we've been doing a lot of work and have been doing work with the immigrant community since our beginning, but really have been focused much more intentionally on expanding the rights and expanding access for immigrants into different services, as well as expanding our ability to reach more folks with immigration legal services. For the last 10 years, that has been primarily our focus. When buses began arriving in August 31st of 2022, we were called by the city of Chicago when they got 24 hours notice to be able to respond. We have built a network of organizations across the city and across the state, both to do immigration legal services, but also to do what we call community navigators. And so we recruit, train, and organize immigrant women, many of whom are undocumented, and we train them on their rights and we train them on public life. And then that allows immigrant women to be leaders in their community, go out and give information around what are the options for immigrants in terms of maybe adjusting their status. What is a U visa? What is a T visa? What are all the updates that have been happening over the last 10 years on DACA? And we see sometimes DACA is open, sometimes closed. So we train folks to give that information. And so all of our folks speak Spanish, right? So as the first buses were going to arrive, we knew that we needed to respond and we needed to be there. So we were able to be there, and for the first couple of months, we're assisting the city in making sure that we could have as many bilingual speakers welcoming new immigrants and being at bus arrivals. It's important to know that folks know that when they arrive to Chicago, they're not under arrest, they're able to be reunited with their family. And if they don't have anywhere to go, that we would be providing shelter. So since then, our work with new immigrants has really evolved primarily into legal services. We have at TRP a legal clinic, and so we've been serving new arrivals for some time. I know that the buses is sort of what everybody's aware of, but new immigrants have been coming for longer periods of time. And we have always been trying to assist figuring out how can we do pro se workshops, for instance, to help more people apply for asylum, since that seems to be the biggest demand right now in terms of folks being able to get some sort of work authorization. Since November 9th, we have been working with the city, the state, and USCIS and the White House to stand up large-scale workshops for EAD, so employment authorization documents, and TPS for folks that qualify. Generally, folks qualify under one of two reasons: TPS, which we're all more familiar with, and parole, which is a second program, which is parole authorized is a law that exists, and it basically says that the president has authority to grant parole and then therefore work authorization to whoever on a case-by-case basis for either humanitarian or for if it's a significant benefit to the state. So you've seen that the president has utilized parole massively in larger numbers than any president in history. And so we've been assisting folks who do qualify under those programs to apply for their work authorization. We need to make sure that we are assisting every new immigrant who does qualify for work authorization to apply, to do so as quick as possible, to make sure USCIS is processing those applications as quick as possible, so folks are able to then get a stable job, are able to get jobs with benefits, better paying jobs, while we simultaneously need to be advocating for more immigrants to be able to receive work authorization. And so we've been doing both of that work over the last year, and have really doubled down our efforts in making sure that we're processing work authorization and that we're expanding who is eligible for work authorization.
Thank you so much, Eda. And Eda, as you mentioned, you were there when the first buses came, and they are still coming. So just to underscore that. Pastor Matt?
Morning, everybody. Buenos dias a todos. Matt from New Life here on the west side of Chicago. Have been doing this work for the last 24 years. Just a quick highlight. New Life Centers does 5 core things. So we do mentoring for young people. We have 500 young people on our mentoring roster. We walk with them long-term. We run after-school programs for kindergarten to 8th graders. We have sports and play as a vehicle for community building. Play is one of the #1 ways to deal with trauma. So we program 2,500 kids through sport and play. We have a street outreach team who responds to every incident of shooting in our neighborhood, Little Village, Pilsen, and Brighton Park, 3 communities here on the southwest side. And then we have victim advocates and case managers, also do work inside of juvenile prisons. And then our last area where our New Vecinos work sits, we started Pan de Vida, and we have a fresh market that we see about 7,000 people per month come through for fresh produce and groceries. And then in September 1st, 2022, first buses started arriving. We started seeing people come to New Life. We opened up a few of our buildings as temporary shelter, 2 of our church locations. And then in the spring of 23, we really started ramping up at the state. And so our work with new arrivals, we call it the New Vecinos program, really focusing on the narrative of these are new neighbors. We don't really talk through, hey, asylum seekers or different things, even though some do fit those categories. It's really how do we welcome them to Chicago as new neighbors. And so we started with basic resettlement. We moved about 25 families from shelter into apartments in May of 23. We started ramping that up. And in the first 3 months, we had moved 275 families from shelter into apartment. And then we've really ramped up in the last few months. And now we've moved 3,100 families, 13,000 people into apartments. And our team is now doing 55 moves per day. And so really decompressing shelters, finding people homes, being able to connect with them. Another pillar of what we do is really what we call the storehouse. And so in Chicago, if you're not from Chicago or don't know how things have been, we had thousands of people living outside of police stations up until December 1st. And then we have about, I think it's 25, 26 shelters right now. We were at 28. And so we are distributing emergency items to all of those spaces and places: socks, underwear, coats, jackets, boots, basic kits, etc. And we've distributed about 250,000 items, and now the team distributes about 55,000 items per month to our partners at ICER and Illinois Coalition of Immigrant Refugee Rights and anybody in need. Third pillar we've been doing is at the landing zone. So we call the space where the buses first arrive is the landing zone. We are there welcoming families to Chicago, guiding them to their next step. If they have other families in the U.S., we will out-migrate them with Catholic Charities to other places, or we will guide them to other friends and family here, really to hopefully set on a path for resettlement and reunification with family or friends. And if not, they'll enter the system. We are also managing a shelter. So we have a shelter here in Little Village with about 200 residents, and we have about half of them are kids and half of those are 0 to 4. So it's a very young shelter, walking with them, caring for them, guiding them. And then the final thing I'll say is we're doing a welcome center where we see 600 to 1,000 walk-ins per day. So we do this because families started showing up. We did not do any of these things before 9 months ago, but our call is really to love our neighbor. We believe that all these people are brought here, are made in the image of God, and need resources, connections. So how do we not only work with our new vecinos, but also our current neighbors, the undocumented and the unhoused? So glad to be here.
Thank you so much, Matt. Really appreciate. I mean, there's so many organizations that are working on this issue. So New Life is one of them, but New Life really is doing just the volume of work that you're doing is totally amazing. And Benji, one thing I think that we don't talk about enough are just, while both Ed and Matt are with organizations and institutions, you are just, I think, symbolic of the many, many thousands of volunteers that have stepped up to work on this issue. Really want to thank you for that. But share with us a little bit about why.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Buen dia. My name is Benji Hart again. I use they, them pronouns. I'm non-binary, I'm queer, I'm African American, I'm a Woodlawn resident, an author, artist, and educator in sort of my freelance work. But as Silvia said, I'm also a volunteer with Concord Missionary Baptist Church, which is a local small congregation here in the Woodlawn community. Pastor Kenneth Phelps has been a pastor for 29 years. He just had his 29-year anniversary. So it's been a long-term staple of the Woodlawn community, which is a predominantly Black, historically Black neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. And we are also now home to the Wadsworth shelter, which I think I'll talk a little bit more about in some of the upcoming questions. But we are now a hub for asylum seekers and recent arrivals. The Wadsworth shelter has about 600 adult residents. So that's dramatically changed the fabric and the makeup of the neighborhood in a very short amount of time. And so Concord Missionary Baptist has been one of the really central organizations here in the neighborhood, building bridges, building relationships between long-term residents and recent arrivals, as well as providing direct services, helping folks get apartments, helping folks apply for housing and for work permits, providing food, shelter, and we also have a bilingual service every other Sunday for recent arrivals as well as long-term residents. So it's been a really special and unique place in the neighborhood where in the midst of a lot of the confusion, a lot of the lack of organization on the part of the city, and a lot of the historic tensions between Black and brown immigrant and non-immigrant communities in hyper-segregated Chicago, it's been a really beautiful space where people have been resisting that history and resisting a lot of the forces that are sort of actively pitting our communities against each other in the current moment to build relationships and to not just, we talk a lot about not just building unity across our communities, but building power between our communities and recognizing how many of the same things long-term Black residents and recent arrivals need and are fighting for and have been fighting for. And this being an opportunity for us to unite our struggles instead of seeing them as in competition with one another. So that's a lot of the work that we do and a lot of the conversations that we've been having as a community.
Thank you so much, Benji. Really appreciate that. But what's really motivated you to step up and lend your time and energy to this effort?
A lot of different reasons. As I said, I'm African American. but I also grew up in a predominantly Puerto Rican community. So I speak Spanish and was read as Puerto Rican most of my young life, and had a lot of Black friends that were Spanish speaking. So for a long time, I've understood Black as not limited to one country or one culture. And so for me, Black solidarity is at the heart of a lot of work that I do, and understanding that that doesn't just mean Black people from the US, that means Black people writ large. And so many of the migrants that are coming here are themselves Black, and are themselves displaced and escaping violence due to structural anti-Blackness in Venezuela, in Colombia, and in other parts of Latin America. We know that anti-Blackness is not just a US issue or a US construction, it's global. So for me as a Black person, this is an important time to remind folks and to show folks, literally, many of us come from the same histories and the same cultures. But even those of us that don't, we are fighting against and struggling against many of the same global systems and structures. And this is an important opportunity for us to combat much of the racism that wants to see us fighting each other and wants to see us in competition with each other. And instead recognize that that is on purpose. A lot of times we use these terms like tensions that I think really erase the structural issues that intentionally pit our communities against each other and keep our communities in conflict and in competition, because we are less powerful and we are less of a threat when we are fighting each other instead of the systems and structures that are actually attacking all of us. And so, I really care about this work, A, because I care about all my neighbors, including my new neighbors, but B, because I think this is a really important opportunity for us to be building power. And I think, we'll talk about it more later, I'm sure, but I think many of these structures understand the threat of having an influx of new Black and brown immigrant, foreign working class people actually adding to the block of long-term residents and communities who have been fighting for affordable housing, fighting for mental health care, fighting for public education, that this is an opportunity to increase our numbers and strengthen our demands. And it makes sense that we would be pitted against each other instead of allowing those demands to grow and to reach new heights. So that's really what I'm fighting for and hoping for in a lot of the work that I'm doing here in Woodlawn.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. And yes, we definitely want to drill down on a lot of the themes that you've raised. And I really would like to, as we go through the questions, get into this idea, well, not idea, understanding that many of those folks that are arriving are Afro-Latino. And how does that play out in this context when we're seeing the tensions emerge between US and African American populations and their new neighbors? And I think that that's likely a perfect segue to Bill to share a little bit about yourself and give us a little bit of context for this work and how you see things that are unfolding.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me participate in this panel. I'm not here representing an organization, so I'd have a few different words to offer. My interest in the issue, I grew up in New York. I was surrounded by people from various populations. And to me, there was nothing particularly odd about that. But what became clear to me when I was in Boston after going to college and staying in the area is that immigration is a bifurcated term. There is the immigration from Europe, and then there is the invasions from the rest of the world. I'm just being blunt. That's the way it's presented. So when people, for example, talk about an immigration crisis, there is no immigration crisis. There's a black, brown, yellow crisis, right? That's been created by various forces. When I was living in Boston in the 1980s, there was a phenomenal level of undocumented Irish migration. That was never described as a crisis. You never heard about INS raids it was INS then, on Irish communities. There were all kinds of deals that were being cut to allow undocumented Irish to work, to get their citizenship, etc. Haitians and Dominicans, not so lucky. And so I think that the issue of race is central when we're discussing migration. And the second thing, which I think that many people in the immigrant rights movement over the years have not played up, is the issue of U.S. foreign policy. As the immigrant rights movement in Britain back in the 80s articulated, we are here because you were there. And I don't hear many people in the United States say that. And particularly when we're looking at, like migrations from Latin America, what is the role of U.S. foreign policy? I mean, people in the United States, particularly white Americans, often relish in ignorance. They love ignorance. They love pretending that because they don't know something, it doesn't exist. And therefore, because they may not know or have blinded themselves to the direct impact of U.S. economic and foreign policy on Latin America, Asia, and Africa, that might have something to do with why people are here. They say, well, why are these folks here? They shouldn't be here. So that's why I'm interested.
Thank you, Bill. And actually, if you could expand on our very first question, and you were definitely already setting, I think, the groundwork for that, in terms of just talking a little bit more on what are some of the historic, systemic, and racial inequalities that give rise to the tensions that we're seeing play out in the migrant situation today. And within that, what has been, as you were starting to say, the role of race and ethnicity in the development and implementation of these policies that perpetuate these systemic inequalities? And I'm going to ask that question.
Okay. So Sylvia, since I could talk for about 90 minutes on that question, you're going to have to really time it, right?
Yeah.
So first of all, it's really critical to understand the U.S. having been founded as a white republic. And by white in the 1790s, they didn't mean Europeans. They meant people coming from specific countries, the core, Britain, Wales, Scotland, Scandinavia, Germany, and France, for the most part. The rest of Europe ended up ultimately being put in a category of provisional whiteness. I mean, literally, that was the term in the 19th century. And so in the beginning, immigration laws granted citizenship to free white men or free white people. The definition of white was changed, it evolved over the course of the 19th and 20th century. So all migrants that came to the United States, outside of those that came from the core countries, were met with great hostility when they arrived. But after a generation, the Europeans became absorbed into the white bloc. They became white. People from the rest of the world, not so lucky. There were all kinds of debates about whether Armenians were white, whether Arabs were white, etc. But we have to understand that all migrants outside of people from those core groups met with hostility. But when you come from the global South, it's a different matter. The hostility doesn't just last, unless you're Cuban, it doesn't just last for a generation. It lasts sort of indefinitely. And thus you had the response to Asian migration, particularly on the West Coast, that was both voluntary and involuntary migration. And the length of the anti-Asian hostility, which we see to this day. So part of what we're dealing with right now is the hostility specifically to migrants from the global South. While there is discrimination at times against certain migrants from parts of Eastern Europe, et cetera, it doesn't compare by any stretch of the imagination with what happens to migrants from the global South. And the second thing is that as a capitalist country, capital exists in part through the competition among the workers, not just the competition of capitalists, the competition of the workers. Workers are constantly fighting one another to survive. They're competing over wages, over homes, etc. Thus, when you have large waves of migrants coming in, the domestic populations of poor people, and particularly poor people of color, frequently look at those migrants as competitors. And when you add on to that, that everybody seems to overstep Black folks, you end up having immense hostility that's there. And so part of what is so critical is the importance of providing education to non-migrants and migrants about the racial politics of US capitalism, about how it actually works. And what does it mean? Is the threat to a poor working class Black person in Chicago from a Venezuelan migrant, right? Or is it from the capitalists, right? Is the threat to a Chicano in Arizona from a Mexican from Mexico City, or someone from Guatemala? And we've got to talk about how people are being played off against one another. Now, one of the mistakes that's made, and I come out of the labor movement, is one of the mistakes that has been made is that very well-intentioned work has been done with migrants, while at the same time ignoring non-migrant people of color. And that is a recipe for an explosion. In the construction industry, for example, you've had waves of migrants from Latin America and from Eastern Europe, and a number of the building trades unions, to their credit, began active organizing of the migrants. But non-migrant people of color, US African Americans, Puerto Ricans, just as two examples, were often overlooked by those same unions. Thus, resentment was building up because people were saying, what do we, chop liver? I mean, what's up? And if the immigrant rights movement isn't addressing that, it's actually playing into the hands of our opponents. So in the interest of time, let me just stop there.
There's so much there to unpack. And as you said, you could talk about this for at least 90 minutes, if not more. But I think, your framing on how capitalists really puts us in competition with each other is obviously very significant. And so I know Benji's done a lot of thinking on this issue. What would you add to this conversation about the historical, systemic, and racial inequalities and how they're playing out? Bill gave us a bit of a global perspective. How do you see them playing out in Woodlawn, Benji?
Yeah, I really appreciate Bill's framing, and I think Woodlawn is a really important sort of case study or microcosm in exactly what Bill is talking about. Woodlawn, the Wadsworth shelter, which is the shelter, the migrant shelter here in Woodlawn, was a school. And it was one of the schools that were closed, for folks who may or may not know a little Chicago history. It was one of the schools that was closed during Mayor Rahm Emanuel's school closings in 2013, which was the largest sweep of school closings in US history. 49 schools were closed here in Chicago, almost all on the south and west sides. And 90% of the students and families who were displaced as a result of those school closures were Black. So it was a very meticulously targeted attack on Black communities specifically, and on poor and working class communities in the city more generally, and resulted in the mass migration of African Americans out of the city. So again, it's important that when we talk about migration, African Americans have been migrants many times in this country's history, and are currently facing a forced migration from cities through gentrification, through eviction, through all of these economic and political attacks on Black communities. We're in the midst of another moment of mass migration for African Americans in a way that I think also is very important to name in a conversation about forced migration. Wadsworth was one of the schools that was closed in this meticulous attack on Black communities. Woodlawn residents fought tooth and nail to keep that school open after it was forcibly closed. Woodlawn residents fought tooth and nail to get it reopened or to be turned into some other form of a community resource, be it affordable housing, be it a community center. Folks fought for a very long time to have Wadsworth transformed into something that would benefit and anchor the long-term African-American community. And for 10 years, the city, after closing the school, ignored those demands, and Wadsworth was dormant for 10 years. And then with this recent attack on Chicago from Governor Abbott and the other Southern governors that we've named, sending asylum seekers and migrants to sanctuary cities almost as a form of punishment. The city had to very quickly figure out where to put folks, and almost overnight, Wadsworth was turned into a shelter. And so this was a huge slap in the face to the Woodlawn community, who, this closed school had really been sort of an open wound for 10 years. And without any input from local residents, the city making this decision to flip it and turn it into a shelter was hugely painful and disrespectful to long-term residents. So you see just from the jump that migrants are being put in this position against, without any knowledge and without any choice on their part, where they're being housed in this space that already has this long political history and carries deep meaning and deep wounds for the local community. And they're being sort of thrust into that context without any knowledge, without any choice. And again, that this sets up folks for tension. This creates tensions from the jump. And as Bill was saying, I think when we, even the term tension, I think can kind of erase what is happening systemically and structurally to actively pit communities against each other. And it can just make it seem like, oh, Black people don't like immigrants, or Mexican communities are anti-Black, or, just kind of ingraining these things as characteristics of communities instead of understanding what are the social, political histories and structures that are actively and intentionally pitting communities against each other. So just again, as Bill was already saying, Woodlawn is experiencing extreme gentrification right now. The University of Chicago is expanding southward, and the construction of the Obama Library has created this boom in real estate interest in the local neighborhood. Black communities and Black families are being forced out at alarming rate. There's all this new construction going up, new condos, fancy luxury housing that is not accessible, not affordable to the local community. And that in the midst of that, migrants are being scapegoated, migrants are being demonized, and blamed for the lack of jobs, blamed for the displacement, and the demographic shifts in the neighborhood. I would argue that's not an accident. I would argue that turning local Black residents' attention towards other Black and brown, poor and working class people as the source of their issues and their problems, at the same time that real estate developers are buying up all this land, at the same time that the University of Chicago is increasing its presence and its policing of the neighborhood, that's not an accident. That's not something that just happened. That is an active way of sort of refocusing Black and brown communities on each other as the source of harm and as the source of violence, rather than the political class, the real estate, and wealthiest interests in the city. So again, a lot of the work that we're trying to do is, yes, most certainly about building relationships and creating understanding and unity between long-term residents and new arrivals, but it's also about understanding who is actually making our lives difficult right now, who is actually making it difficult for all of us to find housing, who is actually making it difficult for all of us to find well-paying jobs, healthcare and mental health care, and all the things that long-term residents have been needing and asking for generations, and that recent arrivals are just as much in need of. What are the actual reasons we're having a hard time finding those things? And what are the things that we need to be demanding together? What are the demands that long-term Black residents have been making, that recent arrivals need to be educated on and learn the history and the contours of the local neighborhood and the local community in order to kind of learn where they can plug in, but also how the long-term residents need to be welcoming in new folks who can actually help amplify our demands and actually, again, are in need of much of the same things that we're in need of. And instead of seeing these new arrivals are now, they're getting all the apartments and they're getting all the housing that we're supposed to be getting, it's a time to say, no, this is proof that what we've been saying is right. This is proof that the demand for an expansion of affordable housing and not luxury condo buildings is what is actually needed in this community and in this city. This is proof that the demand for well-funded public schools that include multilingual education, include interpretation in all languages that are needed by students and families. Things that we've been saying for generations are needed even more now. And it's actually, when we're oriented properly and when we're seeing each other as allies and accomplices, a really important and exciting moment to say, yeah, the things we've been saying, now there's literally twice as many of us saying that. The things we've been demanding, now there's literally a whole new group of new arrivals, new residents who are saying the same thing and who need the same things. And this is a time for us to fight for those things together.
Thank you, Benji. It's really this perfect storm, as you were saying, at the local level of this historic, systemic, and racial inequality and how it's playing out, and the lack of understanding between communities. And to your point, it's things that all people need. And this issue is also really playing out within the Latino community. I'm going to turn to Ede now, in terms of some of these historical, social, and systemic and racial inequalities, and that we are seeing emerging tensions between long-term immigrants as well as the new arrivals. And Ede, you've been at the forefront of this issue. Please share.
Well, thank you so much to Bill and Benji for what you have said. I think there's similar sentiments around even things like the salt on the wound is something that I think a lot of folks who are immigrants have been feeling as well. The immigration system has always been completely unfair. Some people say it's broken. I think lots of us think that it's not, that it's working exactly the way that it's supposed to work, and the way that it was designed to work, which is to keep primarily brown and Black immigrants as undocumented, and to keep us in a position where we are exploitable labor, where we are the labor that is paid the lowest wages, where we are often torn from our families multiple times. And so what we've been seeing in terms of what's been playing out in the undocumented immigrant community in particular, which is the perspective that I come from. I myself am undocumented. I have DACA, which has given me my work authorization, and my work authorization has changed my life and given me so many opportunities. Both of my parents are nearing their 70s and are still undocumented. My oldest brother's undocumented. My middle brother has DACA, and we're in just this perpetual cycle of having to stay undocumented. And for many undocumented families, what we're seeing is either our family or older family members are returning to Mexico and we will potentially never see them again, or our families are dying undocumented. And that is really painful. And it is really painful to see when new immigrants come in, and there is, I think, a narrative issue that we have as well as an advocacy issue that we have. We really do need our local elected officials to be advocating for all immigrants to be able to receive work authorization, and not only new immigrants, because I do think that that is what's adding fuel to the challenges that we're seeing in terms of existing immigrant community not supporting enough of the new immigrant arrivals. We also really need to be making sure that the programs that are stood up are also we also need to acknowledge that many of those programs have never existed for the immigrant community, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't exist, and that doesn't mean that it's the new immigrants' fault. There are other forces that are deciding who can get work permits. There are other forces that are deciding who can get rental assistance and who can't. There are other forces that are deciding who can get healthcare coverage and who can't. And so it is up to us to make sure that we are advocating for all immigrants to be able to receive those services that are needed. As historically, there has never been resettlement for immigrants. We see very differently what resettlement could mean in the Ukrainian community. But we have been seeing immigrants come primarily from the global south for a long time, right? For 30, 40 years. And as folks arrive, there hasn't been an infrastructure set up to make sure that we're receiving folks, that we're welcoming folks, that folks have rental assistance, that folks have shelter, that folks have their own elected, their local elected advocating for them to get work authorization. So we have this community that is perpetually undocumented. We have a community that does not have access to the services that they need. And I think, Benji and Bill said it well, but that doesn't mean that it's new immigrants' fault. We need to make sure that we're putting the pressure and the folks that have the ability to make those decisions. We need to make sure that we are putting the pressure to make it so that as we open up new programs for immigrants, we're also thinking of the existing immigrant community who continue to be working without work authorization and who continue to be left out of many programs.
So thank you, Eddie, for sharing that. And as I mentioned at the onset, we wanted to address this issue head on, right? And I think that in lifting up some of the challenges and tensions that are facing that are obviously at so many different levels in terms of the historical to systemic and racial inequalities and this perfect storm. So Matt, would you have anything to add to that? But also let me transition to, there's a lot of good things that are happening too to try to promote community and community among our new neighbors. So what's being done to proactively address the tensions and the challenges and produce solutions that are policy and systemically focused? Is it really possible to create unity? And you are doing so much on the local level. Share with us a little bit more.
Yeah, and thinking and responding, thanks Bill, Eddie, and Benji for sharing. On the personal level, so my wife's Guatemalan. I have 3 biracial kids, and just thinking through our own journey and as they talk through, hey, Guatemalan, Italian, their history, etc. I think reflecting on some of what Bill was mentioning. You see at Ellis Island, the script of how Italians were talked about and treated. My grandpa came over when he was 7 years old and saying, hey, Italians, non-English speakers, etc., taking resources, and this just the roots of racism in the US and the deflection kind of onto the next group. The historic anti-Blackness, and then talking through even with my own kids when they have to on their forms for school, pick a race and like forced to say, hey, what do I just pick white? Do I pick this? So I think thinking it through it on a personal level and how I talk to my own kids about it. But then Hector put a question in the chat about just the difference, and Eddie touched on it quickly, is the difference of the Ukrainian response versus the Venezuelan response. There's no news about the Ukrainian, and it's a similar number, almost 30,000 people that have come to Chicago, and it's because they're coming in with refugee status. And that goes to what Bill talked a little bit about. It's foreign policy, how we treat other countries in those spaces, and how a Ukrainian can come in with refugee status and can come in and get resources and housing and all these different things. But if you're coming from the global south, or if you're Black or brown, zero access to those resources or limited access. And it's all learning from Eddie every time she speaks. Just the decision points are there. You can decide who's going to get what, and there are some things that can be controlled by even presidential choices, etc. So it's the fact A, that Ukrainians are white. B, the foreign policy with Ukraine versus Venezuela and the things that we even caused to countries like Venezuela. And then it's immigration policy that has been stuck in a standstill for decades and is nothing's moving. So to the systemic things, and to your point, Sylvia, of what we're trying to do, I think in Chicago, there are plenty of great questions and commentary on local neighborhoods, Woodlawn, others where Benji lives, Little Village where I live. is just historical disinvestments, redlining, I mean, under-resourced communities. Those are systemic issues. And how do we not only just put a Band-Aid on something and, hey, we're going to provide housing and care and love for whoever that comes through, right? So our Welcome Center is for the local, undocumented, for our local neighbors, for new neighbors. Our resources are for everybody, but we can't provide housing for everybody. Some of those decisions have been made that we can only use the funds we've been given to provide housing and resettlement for new arrivals. So I think what we're all working on and challenging now is how do we take on the systems of disinvestment in the south and west side of Chicago? How do we take on the systems that are not there for the unhoused? And then how do we build systems of care and community? So one thing we've been doing is welcome to the neighborhood events. So we've done 6 of them where we have 3,100 families that we've moved. We have a map of where they are top to bottom in the city. And in those communities, whether it's Little Village, North Lawndale, South Shore, Woodlawn, we've done West Garfield. How do we have an event saying, here's local neighbors, here's new neighbors, here's churches, here's nonprofits, resources, and have a welcome to the neighborhood event? Because whether you like it or not, whatever quote unquote side you sit, our new neighbors are here, and I think they're a blessing. I think they will bring a lot of great things, and immigration will bring a lot of great things to all of our communities. But I think it happens on the road of relationships. So you have to be together. You have to get to know each other. You have to see each other. We might disagree on certain things, but it happens through the road of relationship, because it's really hard to demonize somebody you know. You can us, them, somebody. You can say, oh, they got this, and that. But when you see the family, when you see the kid, when you meet the unhoused person and you know them, you know their name, it's really hard to demonize them. But then the real work of relationship building and healing starts. So it's personal, it's building bridges of relationships, and then it's systemic transformation. And those 3 things are really complex intersections. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. So Benji, what would you add to that in terms of things that you're doing on the ground and in Woodlawn to proactively address some of these tensions and challenges that are unfolding?
We've done some linking anti-Black and anti-immigrant racism workshops at the church. So we've had some discussions together in English and Spanish about the ways that anti-Black and anti-immigrant racism both reinforce white supremacy and don't just pit our communities against each other, but in fact reify the exact systems and structures that harm all of us. And you might think that by attacking migrants, you may be sort of giving yourself a leg up inside of these systems and structures, but that ultimately that will not be the case. Not only is it immoral to be attacking other people struggling with many of the same things that you're struggling with, it only serves to give more strength and more legitimacy to the same arguments, the same systems, and the same structures that we know will be used against the other group 5 minutes later. And so again, unity is about giving ourselves the power and the base to actually push back against these narratives, push back against the logics used to pit poor and working people against each other, and expand demands for the things that long-term residents, certainly African-American long-term residents, but Black, brown, immigrant, Chicago has such a long and beautiful history of radical organizing. And again, this is a time to welcome new people into that fold and expand the demands that our communities have been making for generations. So some of it has been discussion, some of it has been, workshops and actively having conversations together with each other. But much of it has just been sharing meals and sharing services and worshiping and praying alongside each other. Exactly as Matt already said, once you have a relationship, once you know someone, once you've shared space and had a conversation and laughed and cried with someone, demonizing them, othering them becomes much more difficult. So really treating all of us as neighbors and understanding all of us as neighbors in the same neighborhood, that already does so much and lays an important foundation for much more targeted organizing in the future. So even though I think a lot of what we're doing right now is kind of foundation laying, I I think it's so important because we know none of these things are going anywhere. There will continue to be new waves of migration to Chicago. There will continue to be an increased need for affordable housing and increased need for all the services, just like Ere said, that folks have been needing, asking for, demanding for the long haul, that are now even more necessary, and an even larger number of people need them. So even though I see a lot of the work that we're doing right now is sort of foundation laying and relationship building in what I hope will kind of set the stage for future organizing, I think that is a crucial step, and that we can't organize together if we don't trust each other. We can't organize together if we don't know each other, and if we haven't built relationships that are meaningful and not superficial. And I think that's a lot of what we're trying to do and hoping to do with the church and with other organizations here in Woodlawn, if that answers your question.
Yeah, Benji, let me also ask, just if, there was so much attention in Woodlawn being one of the shelter being one of the more than 20, and the local resistance when the shelter, as you talked about earlier, was being stood up. And there was so much media attention on the conflict, right? So I'm going to ask any of the panelists to just respond to what role do you see the media play in highlighting these tensions? And given the work that you are all doing in the various communities, do you see some of that actually, are your efforts paying off? Do you see some of that dissipating?
Yeah, if I could respond to that quickly, I would say I think the media is playing a very active role in inflaming these tensions. And in fact, in again, sort of reifying old racist beliefs and ideas about different communities. And I think the focus on Woodlawn and the focus on the South Side uh, was itself a very anti-Black narrative, and itself a very anti-Black way of telling the story, which is not to say that there wasn't tension and that there wasn't people from the local community saying and doing really awful racist, anti-immigrant things. Those were absolutely happening, and fighting that as a community was hard, and it continues to be hard. But that being said, there's been virtually no coverage of resistance on the North Side, when we know white communities and white neighborhoods have been just as resistant and just as racist. But that has not been the narrative. I think to a lesser degree, but there's still been more coverage of Mexican communities and Chinese communities and other brown communities also being resistant, which I think, again, is frankly an important conversation to have about anti-immigrant racism exists in immigrant communities in the same way that anti-Black racism exists in Black communities. These are important things for us to unpack. But at the same time, sort of focusing on the South and the West sides as the primary place there has been resistance, when that is not true. And certainly on highlighting the tensions and not all the incredible work that's happening, not all the incredible support and unity building and really active care that people are showing each other is also, I believe, intentional. And making the story be, there are tensions, these communities don't get along, they don't want each other, they don't like each other, they reject each other, and not, here are all the ways that without any resources, without any support from the city, folks are coming together and folks are making it happen, and folks are creating new communities and welcoming in their new neighbors. That has been so much less of the story, when it is just as much a part of the story, when both things are happening, but choosing what you want to cover and choosing what you want to highlight, again, is political. It's certainly about, what is interesting and, what will get the most clicks. But I think more importantly than that, it's really about shaping a political narrative about migrants are not wanted, Black communities are unwelcoming, all the things that sort of help cement the beliefs and values that people already have, rather than seeing all the incredible work that is challenging those historic beliefs and values, and challenging both racist narratives about migrant communities and recent arrivals, but also Black communities, long-term immigrant communities. The media coverage has done a really terrible job of showing the ways that people are coming together. And I don't think that's accidental, because again, I think there's much more of a threat to the political status quo and to the political establishment when our communities come together than there is when we're fighting each other and when we're in competition with each other. So I think highlighting that and stoking that is not accidental. I think it's actually an active attempt on the part of media and those controlling it and invested in it to again sort of keep our communities in competition and at odds with each other, instead of highlighting all the ways, not just that we're already coming together, but that we need to come together if we're actually going to create the types of political shifts that we know all of our communities need, all poor and working class, Black and Brown communities in the city need.
Thank you. And we're almost at the end. We want to get to questions, but I'd ask if Ed and Matt, Bill, if you want to add anything to that in terms of things that are proactively being done or in the role of the media in shaping the narrative.
Yeah, I want to answer about what we're proactively doing. And I think it hit some of the questions that are in the chat too, which is about how do we address some of the concerns of the undocumented. One of the things that we've been doing, and Latino Policy Forum has also been incredibly involved in, is we've seen that the president has an ability to really utilize his power and his authority to grant work authorization. We have seen that he has utilized parole in historical ways and in very good ways. There's a very small fraction of new arrivals that are arriving under this program called parole, and we actually don't see most of them because most of them have family and they've learned about parole, and so then they come and they stay with their families, and so we don't see them in these in shelter, and so then therefore you don't even know that it's happening. But the Biden administration has authorized parole for more than 1 million immigrants. And that means that as immigrants arrive, they're able to apply for work authorization. And that's the example of Ukraine. It actually first started with Ukraine and has since then expanded to Afghanistan, Venezuela, Ecuador, Haiti, and one more country that I'm forgetting. But it should be different, right? It doesn't have to be country by country. And also it could be for the existing immigrant community. And so we've been saying if the Biden administration has recognized that it has parole authority to grant work authorization, that it should do so in a much more fair manner, in a manner that allows the current immigrant community to apply and that is open to other countries as folks arrive. Because it has been rolled out unfairly. And it's not that it's a bad program. Parole is excellent. Parole is the way that it has been working when it is actually the world that I would want to see. I would want to see a world where an immigrant can apply to come into the country, would have protection when they're here, can get a job because they have work authorization, can get a good paying job because they have work authorization. But I also want to make sure that the undocumented are included in that policy. And I also want to make sure that folks from Mexico are included in that policy, because it is time that we make sure that the undocumented are also able to be protected and are also able to have work authorization.
Thank you for that, Eddie. Matt or Bill, would you like to add to this?
Yeah. See, I think we have to reframe the entire narrative. And so part of what's at stake is reminding people that capitalism specifically and capitalism when it comes to immigrants is much like the game of musical chairs. There's always one less chair than there are people participating. And anyone that's ever played the game knows that there's a fierce competition among people playing the game for the chair, but nobody goes after the person who controls the music. And so part of what we got to do is go after who controls the music. And that includes going after the media. So we need to take the media on. We need to develop echo chambers around the country that are speaking truth about what's happening, the kind of discussion we're having right here. But it needs to be on op-eds. It needs to be on talk shows. We need to go after some of these right-wing idiots, and really untangle what's going on there. The second thing is that there needs to be a broader discussion about race. So, for example, I don't use the term black and brown. The term black and brown is a complete misnomer because there's a lot of black folks in Latin America. I mean, black, right? But when you have white supremacy, the way it played out in Latin America, which was different from the way that the Brits played it out in North America, there are people from Latin America who we would say, as a US African American, oh, they're clearly black, right? But they wouldn't necessarily identify that way because of the system of Las Castas. But most people in the United States have no clue what the system of Las Castas was. They have no clue as to what that meant in terms of dividing up Latin Americans. And people in the United States who are non-migrants, and particularly US African Americans, are frequently mystified when Afro-Latinos come to the United States and don't immediately identify as black. And people start saying, what the hell is wrong with them? What are they trying to pretend that there's something else? And completely misunderstanding the way that white supremacy has played itself out. So we need to have a few different discussions, some with our very clearly against our opponents, and some among us, where we need to speak very plainly about these issues if we're actually interested in winning and building power.
Thank you so much for sharing, and I want to make sure we can have some time for questions, and hope that those of you viewing will agree this has been a fascinating conversation. I'm going to close after questions and come back to each with you for 30 seconds of what's your call to action. Of those listening, what can be done, particularly those not in Chicago, how would you encourage them to get involved or stay informed on this issue? So I'm giving you fair warning, going to come back to you, and that's how we'll close. But really want to make sure that we can get to some of the questions that are here. So thank you for those that have been adding your questions. And again, to continue the conversation on this theme, as a society, we have not really cared about the well-being of people, specifically African American, Latin Americans, and other ethnic racial minorities. In light of this fact, is it surprising that long excluded, ignored communities have misgivings about the efforts by the city of Chicago to help newly arrived asylum seekers, and what should be done about it? Okay, who would like to take that on? I think the question is really about the misgivings and the lack of trust with the city of Chicago, and what can we do about that? Anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I would expand it through beyond the city of Chicago, the misgivings that have been happening from all levels of power towards our communities. And so I think what we should be doing is we should be advocating for solutions that help a wider range of folks, right? And so we should be advocating for housing solutions that allow the unhoused to be able to have access to similar programs that are being stood up, like Matt said, right? They're learning, and like, how do then we turn this into making sure that we're serving the unhoused community, and then also advocating for all immigrants in terms of any advocacy that we do. I think there was a question about, when the first question was like, what ends up happening is that then now we have some work authorization that's getting processed really quickly, and there's other folks that now their work authorization is taking longer. I would add myself to that list. I have DACA, and our DACAs are lapsing, right? Because now there's more emphasis on one. And so we need to be better at saying that these are collective issues, and that the solutions need to work for multiple folks. What has happened is that the solutions that are being, Band-Aids in the last 2 years have been very small, and have been just to kind of put a Band-Aid on the problem that is very much at the forefront, which is a new amount of folks that need shelter, new amount of folks that need work authorization, new amount of folks that need, rental assistance, when really there's always been a large population that needs access to that. And so we as advocates also need to do better at saying that we need to come up with more permanent solutions, that address these issues in a more systemic way, and that allow the folks that that experience this and that have been experiencing this to also participate in those solutions.
So another question along those lines is, unfortunately, given what we've seen in Chicago and New York, both groups have played into the politics of division. What would you as panelists recommend needs to happen, not in an ideal world, but in the world as it exists? So, Matt, you want to lead us off on that one?
I mean, in an ideal world, we have systemic transformation that comes and happens. We see immigration system transform. We see housing system transformed. We see systems for the unhoused. So I think the question is a good one, but it's based on what I said earlier. It's just figuring out what can we do right now. So what can we do with the people right in front of us? What can we do to start and begin the confirmations of transformation, of system transformation? And then, man, the long-term play is really a big advocacy piece that many on this panel and in the Zoom overall have been working on for decades. So I think we locally just try to start with who's right in front of us. How do we deal with those families who are in our care? But then at a neighborhood level, how do we work with, again, the unhoused and those different things? So it's really hard. I'll just say it's really hard because you don't want, I mean, you can quickly get hopeless as we continue to try to fight the uphill battle of systemic transformation. But I'll take a different path too, Sylvia, is highlighting your work, is the Wednesday calls that we have. There's over 100 to 150 people who are all in the fight together. And we all come from different views and places, but we're coming to the table to have the hard conversations. And so that's why I appreciate these panels, and then your work on the Welcome to Illinois piece locally. So it's just getting people to the table to have the hard conversations and continue to fight.
Thank you. And with that, I'll say that there's a question on the directory of resources. So we will put that in the chat. We'll put the information on the Welcome to Illinois calls, where you can come and learn about what's happening in Chicago and what groups on the ground are doing. I think someone had a question on how is healthcare being provided. We can share all of that information. You'll find resources in the directory around that. And so, I mean, sort of repeating, I think, a lot of the themes that we've already have at least touched upon, but maybe go a little bit deeper on how do we best respond to the needs of migrants so they feel welcomed? And as Bill discussed in his first remarks, and even I think Benji was saying, how do we do this education? What platforms, places, or groups of people do you see leading in these areas? Would like to address that.
I'd like to say two quick things. One is people need to engage in struggle. And so this is not just a struggle on behalf of migrants. I think that's a mistake. I think that particularly if we're understanding the musical chairs game that's being played, the broader oppressed, the so-called non-migrants, need to see in struggle potential victories that will be in their interest as well as those of migrants. So if we're fighting for housing, we're not just fighting for housing for migrants, right? If we're fighting for jobs, we're not just fighting for jobs for migrants, because there's a way that we can be overly moralistic about this. And I hate to sound cold, but we've got to be about building honest to goodness solidarity between groups. And so I think that becomes very important. The education work, I think, needs multiple platforms. And a lot of it is going to have to be face-to-face, with populations actually getting to know one another and understand background. Like I was saying before about Las Castas. Once you understand Las Castas, a lot of things start to make sense to you as a North American, which didn't before. And so we've got to understand it. We've got to understand, we in the United States, implications of US foreign policy. So that needs to be done through workshops, through webinars, through talk shows. And so there's not like this one location. So I think that both of these things have to be undertaken.
And are there any other, we've been talking about how so much of this happens at the local level, and a lot of you have highlighted that relationships really are key to doing that. But there's also the question on, are there other ways to take this to scale? Do any of you have any thoughts on that? It's a challenge for sure.
I mean, to me, it's just the basic snowball effect. Like, hey, a lot of people look at this problem and say, I have no idea what I could possibly do. And so we just encourage people to jump in where you're at, like Benji's doing. It's right in front of his house. It's the church right by him. He jumped in and he used his, and that's all of us, right? So I think finding the spaces and places you can jump in for us locally, or those who are in Chicago, you can follow me, you can follow us online. We post stuff all the time. You can serve and feed families. That starts the relationship path. But don't just make sure your only interaction with this topic isn't just the news, the newspaper, social media, et cetera. And find a way to just jump in and get to know people. So that's locally how I'd respond.
And then, how has community building, healing, and education been working? Those of you that are on the ground doing this without feeling like it's some kind of re-education. It seems important to not to try and teach marginalized communities about their own experience, while also migrants might not know the context they're stepping into our disinvested Black communities also might not know how the legal migration works. So really a question around how do we work with folks without feeling like we're teaching people about their own experiences? Any thoughts on that?
I think it's, you know, I think generally it's that we need to organize to make system changes with folks understanding their experiences. It is, I'm very personally, it is very hard to assist folks in applying for work authorization when my parents can't apply for work authorization. So that means that like what I need to be doing is both. I need to be helping folks apply for work authorization if they qualify, and I need to be expanding who qualifies for work authorization. It's not either or, it's 100% we have to do both. It's listening to the fact that folks have been marginalized, that folks are in pain, and how do we utilize that pain to action to make it so that we have a much more just policies, because you can't take away people's experiences and you can't minimize them.
And building on that, there's a question is how can one responsibly and constructively respond to the long-term undocumented immigrants' complaints about lack of protections for them in the face of the asylum applicants' ability to apply for work permits? How do you respond to your parents? How do you respond to the volunteers that you work with who are helping people while they can't get work authorization for themselves?
That it is unfair, that they're right, that they have been given the short end of the stick. That it is up to us though to change it. Because folks, we just can't get anything across Congress. And so we should be putting a lot of pressure on the Biden administration to respond and to make sure that he's changing policies that are within his control to make it more fair. But it has been a very unfair system to the long-term undocumented community. And I think it's important we acknowledge that and that we work towards making it better for all immigrants.
And this will be the last question, then I'll ask you each for what's your call to action? What would you recommend to folks that are listening in? And someone's asking about the disabled. So can someone please speak to how current policies and programming are assisting people with disabilities who come to the US? And are there any detrimental issues that this assistance can harm them in the future? Does anyone have any experience with that, with how this is impacting the disabled?
The only experience that I have is we're members of Healthy Illinois, which is a campaign to include immigrants regardless of their immigration status and some healthcare benefits. And within that, there's been we've had some significant wins in Illinois, but they haven't included things like long-term care with people with disabilities really need. And they haven't included things like home-based care, which people with disabilities really need. And so there is, even when we are able to win some policies, oftentimes folks with disabilities are still left out, and the services and the unique needs that community has is also, overlooked sometimes, and sometimes also harmed because we're not responding to that. And the only thing I can from that experience is that I imagine that with new arrivals that is also happening. I know from when folks arrive on the bus, there are folks that do have disabilities and have unique needs and I don't know that we're fully equipped to be able to respond to those. Maybe Matt knows a little bit more.
So in the interest of time, we're coming on close. I'd like to give you all just 30 to 45 seconds or so for just what would you encourage people to do? What's your call for action? Bill, why don't we start with you?
I feel like I've spoken enough. I guess what I would say is, one, we need to build a broader national movement around these issues that clearly targets U.S. foreign policy and the racialization of migration. And we need to be very, very clear about that. We should not be playing, Ukrainian migrants against Guatemalan migrants. We should show the hypocrisy in what's being done when certain migrants and refugees are celebrated and others are demonized. I'll leave it at that. And thank you
so much. Matt, and then Benji and Ede. I'll give you the last word, Ede.
I think one, educate yourself. I'm constantly learning. I sit and learn with Ede, with Bill, with Benji, just as much as everybody else. So just continually to learn. Don't act like you know it all or have it together. And me, especially as a white leader, how do I sit under leaders of color and learn in that way? Two, build relationships with the other. I think whoever in your mind is the other, and we know who that is in our own mind, the people that, hey, we look to, our own prejudice, our own racism, our own things that we are facing. How do we move near to the other? And that's the hardest question, I think, is how do you build that relationship? And then find a way with the groups that are focused on the advocacy, both the city, the state, the national level. How do you jump in and be a part of the movement?
Okay. Benji?
I'm going to try and be brief. I think we need targeted and radical demands that we're mobilizing mass numbers of people around. And as Bill said, in order for there to be solidarity, our demands have to actually cover the needs of everyone being targeted. We can't just demand housing for one group. We have to demand housing for everyone. We can't just demand the expansion of rights and of protections for certain populations. We need to demand it for everyone. And that's how you get a large number of people behind one demand. And here I want to highlight the demand to abolish ICE because it's still a demand we should be making. It's deeply relevant to this conversation. And it's a demand that came out of African-American and Black, trans, and queer migrant folks in the immigrant justice movement working together. That the demand to abolish ICE comes out of a framework of police and prison abolition that was learned by folks in the immigrant justice movement from working with African-American organizers. And so the demand to abolish ICE shows the radical visions that we arrive at when our communities are actually acting in solidarity and learning from each other. And by that same token, if we're saying abolish ICE and we're not saying abolish the police, there's a problem. If we're saying defund the police and we're not talking about defunding the US military, there's a problem. And all of these systems and structures are interconnected, as so many folks have already pointed to. And in order for many of the things we're demanding to be possible, there has to be a redistribution of resources. And that redistribution of resources should come from the same systems and structures that are harming Black and Brown communities, that are harming immigrant and undocumented communities, that are committing genocide in Palestine as we're speaking. We should be demanding as movements that we defund the police, prison, and military systems, including ICE, including the Department of Homeland Security, and put those resources into the exact things that Ere has named, that Bill has named, the things that we know our communities need that are being massively underfunded or defunded because all of our resources are going into policing, incarcerating, and killing Black and Brown people across the planet, not just in the US. So it's our duty, it's our moral duty, but it's also our strategic duty to lift radical demands that create solidarity and cover the widest population possible, because that's how we're going to get the most people behind what we are demanding. And I think that has to include both, not just what we want to see resources go to, but also what we want to see them taken away from, which for me is always the police, prison, and military systems.
Thank you. Ede?
I have a very direct call to action, March 9th, 2 p.m. at Arturo Velázquez. If you're in Chicago, 2800 Southwestern, we'll send this information out. We will be standing with undocumented dreamers who are calling on the Biden administration to grant them work authorization. So again, it's Saturday, March 9th, 2 p.m. at Arturo Velázquez.
So we are at time, we're just a little over. We have recorded this. We will be sending all the participants, anyone who tuned in an email with all these resources and this information. Again, please join me in thanking Alianza America, Center for American Progress, Latino Policy Forum, National Immigrant Justice Center, and the Resurrection Project. And thank you to each of the panelists profoundly for, I think, this enlightening and engaging conversation. Thank you all for the work that you're doing. Look so forward to being in partnership with you, and wishing everybody peace and blessings. Take care, everybody.